Hi, everyone. Welcome to our latest session of App Hacks. I'm Sarah Hughes, a senior solutions engineer here at Squid, helping customers build with our product every day. A little bit about Squid. We are a toolkit on top of Salesforce that allows you to customize everything that your user sees. So we help you build apps that work the way that your people do. And we've been hosting App Hacks to just have conversations with folks out in the Salesforce community to just talk about what we do every day for our customers and theirs. It's my extreme pleasure to be back here today talking to Christine Marshall again. She is a Salesforce evangelist for Salesforce Ben, and I will let her give a little intro herself too.
Thank you, Sarah. It's so nice to be talking with you again. It's been a couple of months since our last chat. For everyone that doesn't know me, my name's Christine Marshall, and I work for Salesforce Ben. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem since 2014, where I accidentally became a Salesforce admin. And since then, it's been a really long and really fun road, learning more about Salesforce. So it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Christine, for the little bit of background. And just I know we've kind of gone over this before, but how did you get into that actual classification as a Salesforce evangelist? Kind of what led you there?
So, like I said, I fell into Salesforce completely by accident. I was working in sales support management and we used a very old CRM tool. And I suggested that we needed a new one. And they said, yeah, that's great. We can have one, but you have to select it and you have to, get it and set it up. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire with Salesforce, but it was so intuitive. And I quickly realized that I loved Salesforce a lot more than I loved the rest of my job. So I did a couple of years working as a Salesforce admin, and then I went to London's Calling, a community conference, and I saw some of the most amazing speakers, and they showed me things that I had no idea that Salesforce could do. And I thought that day, I would like to do that. I would like to talk and educate other people about the possibilities of the platform and make it more accessible to everyone. So I put myself forward to speak at a couple of community conferences and got accepted. And while I was there, one of the people in the community, Paul Ginsberg, said, you should write, you should set up a blog. So I did. I created my own blog. And from there, everything just really snowballed. I started writing for other blogs, including Salesforce Ben. And then the opportunity came up last year to join them full time. And I love it. It's like a dream come true.
I love that. I feel like I can identify with you getting introduced to Salesforce and then realizing you don't want to do anything else. Same with Squid. got introduced with Squid, didn't want to do anything else but build with Squid always. So I'm glad we're around. Yeah, just a few pieces of business. I see our moderator helping us out. We will announce the raffle winner at the end of our conversation, and we're going to try to keep it as brief as possible, just kind of a little break in the day, and really talk about, I think today what we had talked about, was setting our applications and our builds and our development patterns up for success. And, there's just a lot of conversation. It feels like it's really been heightened in the last year of dealing with a pandemic about being productive. And we talk a lot about being productive, and then sometimes we talk so much about being productive, we're not as productive as we might want to be. So I think I just kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit more about, when you are taking on a brand new project or going through CI/CD and burning through backlog, requirements, what are your top tips on setting your project up for success from the get-go?
Well, I think you make a really good point there about, balancing. And the past year has been really interesting. Whilst everything else has sort of slowed down, I feel like Salesforce has sped up because there's such a huge focus on becoming more digital and rolling out projects. That was my experience for sure. As soon as the sort of pandemic kicked off and lockdown started, I had more and more people coming to me with new projects, lots of conflicting demands, lots of time management issues. And I think one of the key things to building great apps and getting them out fast is to do your requirements gathering and do it really, really well. Really understand what people are looking for. What is the problem? What are you trying to solve? How can you solve it? And I would think, measure twice, cut once. So if you can get the requirements down first and really understand what it is you're trying to build, then you won't have to keep going back and fixing things that you missed the first time round.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that's one of the reasons I have found Squid really helpful is we can kind of get to that rapid development piece, but it doesn't undercut the time needed to do that discovery and potentially like proof of concept, proof of capability work with your users. Do you have any tips and tricks for kind of when you're working with a new customer, a new group that maybe hasn't been through this process? Do you have any tips and tricks for kind of talking through why that measure twice, cut once is so important? Because I've found that it's a struggle for some folks, and there's not always a one size fits all for every project.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be honest, people don't understand what a Salesforce admin does most of the time. They have no concept of how long anything takes or the complexities if you start creating something and then you have to unpick it. Once you start getting into objects and relationships and creating things, it's much harder to go back and undo that and redo it than if you start it properly the first time round. And I think what you need is really good communication with your users and your key stakeholders to really sit with them and watch what they're doing. I know when we've had a conversation before, one of the things that we've talked about is actually getting them to record what they're doing so you can really understand their user journey and from there identify what are the sticking points, where does it go wrong, how much manual work is involved. Because one of the things that we think about when we roll out an app is getting that core functionality in there. But actually, if you can solve some quick wins at the same time, then that's great for user adoption of any new apps and new features as well.
Yeah, I think when we were talking before that.
Looks like we might have lost Sarah, but hopefully she'll come back in a minute.
Sorry, everybody, we're getting some technical difficulties. Chris, I'm Annie. I'm with Squid. I'm the one running the camera behind the scenes. Looks like Sarah's coming back. Christine, Mark had a question in the chat that I thought maybe you could speak to.
Of course.
He wants to know, with requirements gathering in mind, what advice would you give to admins on how to gather requirements well when the organization they work for maybe doesn't understand what they're asking for?
Oh, that's such a typical issue. It's so hard. And I think one of the things to do is to create user stories, which is a concept that I didn't understand for a long time. But it can really help to document what people are asking for. So starting off with a problem and then putting that into a statement, I want this to achieve this. And then as an admin, you can work out, well, what features can support me in doing that, in sorting out that requirement. But documentation is definitely the way to go. As I said, recording people, what they're doing, and speaking it back to them to make sure that you have understood what they're asking for. Sometimes when you repeat it back to people, they'll stop you and go, no, that's not what I meant, or, oh, I forgot to mention this. So you can often need a couple of sessions of requirements gathering to really truly get to the core of what you're trying to achieve.
That's a great answer. Sorry about that. I'm back, folks. I think that, and maybe we can find, Annie, some resources that we can share. I know that we have a ton of resources about how to gather user stories and human-centered design on the Squid website, as that is one of the foundations, we just hold as, a process and a technique. And I love the question, Mark, about when, I think, in my experience, you're typically working with someone that doesn't understand exactly what it takes to put in an application always. And that's why they're seeking help. And so it's always nice to have some information in your back pocket or a framework about how to do that, and that user story journey. I did kind of want to go back, because I think one of the things we talked about was how wonderful, like one of the silver linings of everyone kind of being at home is most companies now do have software in place for video recording. So it actually really gives us this great tool that we might not have had before, because users can do different things, when they feel like they're being watched or kind of tested. It has been my experience sometimes. So if you're just like, hey, show me what you're doing, and then, really breaking it down into those simple points feels like the easiest way to kind of start forward. And kind of speaking of some of those, pandemic changes, have you seen, the last year change what our end users and the business might be expecting out of the features we are building into these applications?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot more emphasis on integrations and working, getting emails in the system, logging activities. I think it's easier to some degree because most people are working from home, so they're not on the road and they're not so reliant on mobile apps. They can be at the computer and using Salesforce. So I think they maybe have a greater appreciation of it. I think one of the other things about gathering requirements and helping people during this time is to be as approachable as possible. I think sometimes IT doesn't always have the best reputation for being helpful, and I think Salesforce admins are completely different. So because we juggle so many things and so many of us are from a very different, usually a business orientated background, I do think we find it easier to gather requirements. And I always say to people, tell me what you need, because Salesforce can do it. So don't hold back. Don't think it won't be able to. If you tell me what you want, I will build it. And
right.
Talk to me.
Yeah. I think that point of conversation, which is really empathy, right? Like that's the basis of finding empathy for your end user, and then getting an understanding of what the business sometimes needs out of the tool. And sometimes those are competing needs. Sometimes, when you really start digging in, I think we've probably both found it's the same need. It's just been articulated differently. We have a question from Chris. What's the best way to bring stakeholders along for the journey to make sure they're happy with what's being delivered? Any pro tips, Christine?
So that's a really great question. And again, it's all a case of communication and getting people on board as quickly as possible. And I think you've got multiple ways of doing that. I always like to have a super user community by my side. They're the ones that really translate the day-to-day user requirements to me and give me very honest feedback on what people need. But then you also need a steering committee or a governance committee as well. And that's where I would say bring on board your senior stakeholders there and get them to communicate with you what the business is trying to achieve, what their aims are, what their vision is for the future of Salesforce, so that you can then bring all of those things together. And again, it's about educating people and appreciating that they have their roles and their jobs, and their job is not to understand everything that Salesforce can do. It's our job to communicate all of the possibilities and then to translate their requirements into a technical solution and be able to communicate it back to them in layman's terms, in business terms that they can understand and appreciate.
Yeah, I love your idea about the user community. To me, that's one of the exciting things about building on Salesforce is then you can use the other tools available to you in Salesforce to kind of build your supporting structure of the other work you're doing there. And I've always found that to be really helpful, and have like some chatter groups and just really maintain communication. I think that's key. I think however you're doing it, is it a weekly email? Is it your conversation? Is it, the user group and then different groups? But yeah, that just make sure you're always communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep it all in Salesforce where you can. That's always my preference, is to keep everything in Salesforce, because I want people in Salesforce using it. So I'll use Chatter for a super user group, and I'll have a Salesforce updates group where I pump out information about new features or enhancements that we're making. The user guide lives on Salesforce. Everything stays in there as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Because I think one of the things that I'm always trying to help align with is like a source of truth, is have a one source of truth as you're moving forward with any new project. And the minute we start getting, disparate streams, it really starts confusing that. And if we're building applications on Salesforce, the more that we can drive folks back to that platform and get them comfortable there, the better our data is for all of the cross, projects you might be helping to support for the business. So we had another good question. I really like this one too. You mentioned the need for good documentation. Are there specific tools or software and or principles? This is a multi-part, and or principles you would recommend for building up a documentation library?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. So again, I typically keep things on Salesforce, so I tend to use Cases to record all of my backlog. So I keep everything there. People can submit their ideas, their requests for enhancements, and that helps me keep it in a single place. And I get to use all of Salesforce's native reporting and dashboards. I can record my own time, how long I think a project's going to take. So I think Cases is a great way to do it. Outside of that, I'm a huge fan of anything, Google Docs and Sheets to aid collaboration so that people can be working on things at the same time. But again, wherever possible, I would try and keep it in Salesforce where I can.
Yeah, I think that's a pattern we would follow. I'm typically supporting customers that are using specific software to kind of implement, and I don't know that I have any really specific software or tools. It's just like kind of use what you might have available to you, and just stay as organized as possible. I think one of the things I really love specifically about Squid on Salesforce is you can kind of build a sub-management page that helps you document those things with a few custom fields, to kind of go along with your pages. So you've got documentation like from a builder perspective, and then documentation for your end users. Yeah, I think the principles also, we've talked a lot about this within Squid and our professional services division, is also this kind of idea of, to go along with user stories, is like acceptance criteria. And then, what is the user really trying to do? So the principle behind documentation from an end user perspective might be, what are they really trying to do on this page? And then kind of so backtracking that user story that you already identified early on in the project, and kind of aligning that then with, this is how I do this to do this and this and this, and, rearranging that. So, that's kind of a principle I like to follow in the change management piece after you're kind of live with everything. So we talked before about this idea that I think kind of goes along with all of this, which is, kind of getting to the end first. And you use the term that gets thrown around a lot, and I love it, which is fail fast. So I did want to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about that concept and kind of why you think it's a great, you hear fail. I know sometimes management kind of, what do you mean you're going to fail? So why are we all loving fail fast?
I think because sometimes you have to get something out there and roll, a minimum viable product out and get feedback on it to know that you're heading in the right direction. And there is this whole concept of failing fast. And that just means identifying missing features or identifying problems sooner rather than later, before you've got really in the weeds of what you're doing and it becomes very hard to unpick. So I like the concept, but it can be quite hard to sell to people who are very worried. When they hear fail, they think disaster. I think it means launching your MVP, and then gathering feedback quickly to say, actually, it needs to do this, or it's missing this feature. And then you can iterate and you can get onto phase 2 very, very quickly. So it's almost more about phases, go live as quickly as possible with a phase 1 product, get the feedback and keep building on it, because that is the joy of Salesforce, is that you can get things out so rapidly. That's the whole point. That's what it's designed for. We could sit here and we could, project manage something and design it and spend a year, spend 18 months, and then get to the point of rolling out, and you'll still have a lot of the same problems because users use it differently. It's never the way that you expect. You just can't predict what people are going to do. And so actually it's better to get it in their hands and get them testing it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've talked about before, and I'm sure a lot of folks who are watching have been in this situation where, you know, sometimes you're given the requirements for the tool and sometimes you're given a deadline and learning how to get, you know, learning how to, you know, divvy up your project and meet that need for the business. And sometimes the deadline is the need for the business. I love that idea of working in phases and really clearly identifying the MVP, which is minimal viable product for everyone that might not have heard the acronym before, you know, or most valuable product, you know, whatever we want to go with that. But, you know, like really thinking about it in phases, I think helps get buy-in from users and stakeholders also to kind of prove out, like really align, you know, how are we measuring success for the product and kind of aligning that as we're doing that user journey piece and the persona piece and the user story, then how are we measuring success? And let's get that MVP out there, measure the success and see where we can tweak and kind of dependent, you know, change what needs to be changed for the further phases. I think, you know, we had kind of talked before about some tips and tricks around, you know, sometimes it really helps to put numbers around, you know, getting this stuff out the door, and this, you know, aligning it with budget and time spent. And I know I have plenty of examples of where I have followed a path that didn't get me out the door really quickly. And so I personally have some examples to share, but I think, you know, that's one thing that I am a really big fan of right now. Also, when you are having those conversations with stakeholders is, you know, the sooner or the more you can align it with budget and time is really one of the best tools to get folks to see how necessary some of the early work is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes down to prioritization as well. And that can be one of the hardest things as an admin, to actually have the confidence to ask key stakeholders and senior stakeholders to prioritize, because not everything can be a priority. So you need them to say what is most important, what has to go out in phase one, what can we roll out later on, what is really, really key. And that can help you then identify your requirements, work out, well, what's dependent on which bit. So what all has to be packaged up together and what can go later on. But it's hard to say no, especially as an advocate for being very friendly and very, you know, open and saying Salesforce can do whatever you want it to do. But it takes time to build something.
Yeah. So on that note, we have one more question that I think we probably have time to answer here from Mark again. And this is another really great question. You know, how do you handle complaints? So if you are phasing things out, how do you handle complaints about the phases you propose being too far away or not good enough? Yeah, I know we've all dealt with those.
It is a really, really good question. And I do think it comes down to relationships, and it comes down to forming those key user groups, super users, having a steering committee. You need the backing of the business behind you. And that's the truth of the matter. You need to get the buy-in from your senior stakeholders. You have to have agreed what the priorities are, because especially if you're a solo admin, there are only so many hours in the day. You can only achieve so much. So you need the business to agree a plan with you, so that when you get complaints, and you will, because you can't keep everyone happy, that you can explain that as a business, this is how it's been prioritized and this is how it's going to be rolled out. But that when they do get their app, then they'll be happy.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've really learned is also exposing the requirements in the roadmap sometimes to your user group, so that they can really clearly see what the priority is, and maybe even if you've assigned some timing or story points or level of effort around that, it kind of also helps folks who either on either side, end user or stakeholder group, understand, that there was some logic and reasoning and, industry standards, best practices applied to why these things got left out. So I think just kind of always, if you can publish that stuff, it's always been really helpful in my experience, so that all users kind of see the behind the scenes part. And then definitely assigning priority and timing, I think, helps have those conversations, because there's always something that gets trimmed at the end. There's never enough time to get everything in on the deadline sometimes. Before we get too far, and I did have two pieces of business I wanted to go through before we wrap up. The first is we do have a raffle winner, and our raffle, and I apologize on my pronunciation, is Paneet Khanna. You will be getting a Snack Magic box. So thank you for entering the raffle and being part of our App Hack session. We really appreciate all the involvement and engagement that we've been getting. And then I did just want to put one quick announcement out there. We've been trying to do an App Hacks every month. With summer holidays, we will be skipping June, and we will be back in July. So just keep your eye out on our social media accounts and our website, and we will announce when our next session is coming up. And Christine, again, if you have any final thoughts, I'd like to give you the floor to kind of talk about them. If not, it's really been lovely to be able to speak with you again.
Thank you. No, I just think, the takeaway for me from this is it's all about transparency and relationships, and making sure that you have the support of the business by getting your super users, getting your key stakeholders involved, so that you have the backing, and that backing will allow you to prioritize and create roadmaps and build great apps that everyone will enjoy.
Well said. Thanks again, Christine. And thanks again for all of the great questions, everyone. Have a great day. And I don't know what I need to do.